The morning was calm, the kind of stillness that makes the world feel as though it has paused just for you. The sun was just beginning its climb over the horizon, scattering soft beams of golden light across the surface of the lake. My wake, that thought always carried with it a sense of pride and reassurance, because I had worked hard, saved, sacrificed, and finally bought this piece of property where the lake stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the sky. It wasn't a small puddle or a runoff pond. It was a real lake, deep enough to fish, wide enough to paddle for hours, and meaningful enough that I had envisioned it as my escape from the noise of life. Owning it felt like a quiet triumph. I had recently purchased a small fishing boat, nothing extravagant, nothing loud or disruptive, just a modest aluminum boat with a motor barely strong enough to push me across the lake. It was more than transportation, it was a dream fulfilled, the final missing piece in this chapter of peace I had planned for myself. The thought of sitting out there in the middle of the water, away from everything else, letting the ripples rock me gently while I cast my line, was what it kept me pushing through long work days and longer nights. That morning, I backed the truck up near the shoreline, careful not to churn the grass too much. The boat slid off the trailer into the water with a soft splash, the kind of sound that makes a fisherman's heart stir. I stood for a moment, hands on my hips, watching it bob gently, the reflection of its silver body shimmering on the rippling water. I inhaled deeply, savoring that mix of lake water and pine trees. This was peace. This was home. And then, of course, it began. It started with the sound of footsteps, rapid, urgent, and entirely too loud for such a quiet morning. I turned my head and saw Mrs. Kendall, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, striding down the path like she was storming a castle. She wore her usual visor, the kind with her initials monogrammed on it, and clutched a clipboard like it was a sword. Even from a distance, I could see her lips moving, her voice carrying across the water before she was close enough to hear. I didn't need to catch every word to know what she was saying. You can't do that. That's not allowed. That's against HOA rules. I sighed. It hadn't even 10 minutes. By the time she reached me, her face was red, not from exertion, but from fury. She gestured wildly at the boat like it was some kind of criminal. You can't just launch that here. This lake is part of the community, and you're violating the guidelines. I turned to her slowly, trying to keep my voice calm, though my patience was already thin. This isn't the community's lake. This is my property. The entire lake sits within the boundaries of my deed. I've checked, double-checked, and I even confirmed it with the county office. This lake is mine, she sputtered, her eyes widening. That can't be true. The HOA has jurisdiction over all common areas, and that lake is a common area. We've all agreed to that, no, I said, pointing toward the wooden stakes that still marked the property lines. The HOA map is wrong. The official survey shows otherwise. The HOA doesn't own this lake. I do. She blinked like I had just told her the sky was green and the grass was purple. Then her jaw set firmly and she scribbled something down on her clipboard. I'll be reporting this. You can't just do whatever you want. There are rules for a reason. I didn't respond right away. I knew from experience that arguing with her in the moment would only escalate things, and I didn't want to start the day that way. So I gave her a polite nod, climbed into my boat, and started the motor. The gentle hum filled the air, mixing with the sound of water lapping against the hull. For a brief second, I allowed myself to block her out, focusing instead on the shimmer of the water and the open expanse before me. But Mrs. Kendall wasn't finished. As I drifted away from the shore, I could still hear her voice rising behind me. This is not over. You'll regret this. At the time, I laughed it off. People like her thrived on drama, on making themselves feel powerful through confrontation. I thought at worst she would send a nasty email or call an emergency HOA meeting to lecture me about supposed violations. I didn't think it would escalate. I didn't think she would actually call the police. An hour later, when the sun was high and I was finally relaxing in the middle of the lake, I heard sirens. At first, I thought they were far away, unrelated to me. But then they grew closer until I could see the flicker of blue and red lights reflecting off the trees lining the shore. My heart sank, but not from fear, more from disbelief. Could she really have done it? Could she actually have wasted police resources on this? I paddled the boat back toward shore, cutting the motor so I wouldn't appear hostile. 2 officers stood on the bank, hands resting casually near their belts, trying to figure out what exactly they had been called for. Mrs. Kendall was there too. Of course, arms crossed, looking smug like she had just solved some great crime. "There he is," she said, pointing dramatically as though she'd uncovered a fugitive. "That's the man. He's violating HOA rules. He launched that boat illegally on our lake." The younger officer raised an eyebrow, clearly trying not to roll his eyes. He turned to me. "Sir, can we talk for a second?" I nodded, steering the boat until it scraped gently against the shore. I stepped out, water soaking the soles of my boots. "Of course. What seems to be the issue?" The officer glanced at Mrs. Kendall, then back at me. "We got a call about a dispute regarding property use. She says you're violating HOA regulations." I took a deep breath, pulling the folded survey papers from my pocket. I had kept them with me for moments exactly like this because I knew how relentless the HOA could be. Handing the documents over, I explained, "This lake is on my deed. You can check with the county. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." The older officer took the papers, scanning them carefully. His expression shifted from skepticism to mild surprise as he pieced it together. "Looks like he's right," he said to his partner. "This whole lake is within his property lines. A OA doesn't have authority over it." Mrs. Kendall's face twisted in disbelief. "That's not possible. We've always used this lake as a community space." "That may be," the officer replied calmly, handing the papers back to me, "but legally, it belongs to him. Unless he's committing an actual crime, there's nothing we can do here." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Kendall's lips trembled, like she was about to launch into another tirade, but even she seemed to realize she had lost this battle. Her face flushed red, and she huffed, spinning on her heel and storming back toward her house. The younger officer gave me a sympathetic look. "Sorry about the trouble, sir. Sometimes these HOA disputes get dramatic." I nodded, managing a small smile. "I appreciate you coming out. I know you've got better things to do." Once they left, the quiet returned. The lake rippled softly again, the sun still glistened off the water, and for the first time all morning, I felt a true sense of victory. It wasn't just about owning the lake anymore. It was about standing my ground, about reminding myself that I had earned the peace I was trying to enjoy. No clipboard, no HOA rulebook, no neighbor with too much time on her hands could take that away from me. Still, as I climbed back into the boat, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. People like Mrs. Kendall didn't give up so easily. She'd find another angle, another rule, another way to try and assert control. And maybe, just maybe, that was going to turn this peaceful lake into the stage for a much bigger battle. But for now, I let the motor hum again, let the water carry me back to the middle, and allowed the stillness of the lake to remind me why I had chosen this place. Whatever storms the HOA might try to stir up, this lake was mine. And on that morning, surrounded by shimmering water and open sky, I felt free. You said. The days that followed that first confrontation should have been quiet, but they weren't. If anything, the tension thickened like a storm cloud hanging low over the neighborhood. I went about my usual routine: early mornings with coffee on the deck, afternoons tinkering in the shed, evenings watching the sunset over the water, but there was always this faint hum of unease in the background. I'd catch glimpses of neighbors walking past slower than usual, whispering to one another, casting sideways glances in my direction. I wasn't naive. I knew the story had spread through the neighborhood grapevine faster than lightning. Mrs. Kendall made sure of that. The thing about an HOA is that it thrives on control. It's not just about lawn heights, mailbox colors, or the width of your driveway. It's about power. It's about a handful of people convincing themselves they are the guardians of order, the keepers of civility, the chosen ones who dictate how everyone else should live. My boat on my lake had cracked that illusion, and cracks are dangerous to those who believe in absolute authority. I first realized how deep the resentment ran when I went to the mailbox. There was a letter inside, neatly folded, typed in that overly formal HOA tone that always manages to sound both polite and threatening at the same time. It read, "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your recent use of the lake violates the community's shared environment and harmony. While your interpretation of property ownership may differ, we urge you to cease and desist launching watercraft until this matter is formally resolved. Failure to comply may result in fines, sanctions, or further legal action." I laughed when I read it, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that comes from joy. It was sharp, bitter, a laugh to keep anger from boiling over. They still couldn't admit the truth, even with county records against them. They were clinging to their illusion, hoping intimidation would scare me into compliance. I tore the letter in half right there at the mailbox, letting the pieces scatter onto the gravel, but the harassment didn't stop at letters. That weekend, I decided to take the boat out again, determined not to let them bully me. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, the kind of day where sunlight dappled through the trees and the lake sparkled like a jewel. As I prepared to launch, I noticed movement along the far bank. A group of neighbors had gathered, some with their phones out, recording me like I was some spectacle. Mrs. Kendall was among them. Of course, her clipboard replaced with her phone, documenting every move I made. I pushed the boat into the water anyway, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hesitation. As the motor hummed and I glided away from shore, I could hear the faint murmurs of disapproval, the exaggerated sighs, the dramatic gasps. They wanted me to feel like an outcast, but what they didn't understand was that solitude was exactly what I craved. Out in the middle of the lake, their voices faded into nothing, replaced by the soothing lap of water against the hull. Still, the battle escalated. A week later, I found another letter, this time delivered by certified mail. It wasn't from the HOA board, it was from their lawyer. The language was heavier, filled with legal jargon designed to intimidate. They threatened lawsuits, injunctions, even the possibility of forcing the sale of my property if I didn't comply with their community standards. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the letter spread out in front of me, a glass of bourbon sweating beside it. I thought about how far they were willing to go, how much energy they were pouring into this crusade against one man and his boat. A part of me wondered if it was worth it. I could easily keep the boat in the shed, fish from the shore, live quietly, and avoid the conflict. But another part of me, the stronger part, knew that giving in would set a precedent. If they won this battle, they'd keep coming for more. First the boat, then the shed, then the way I mowed my lawn, until every inch of my life was under their control. No, I wasn't going to let that happen. I called my own lawyer the next morning. A calm, steady man named Harris who had handled property disputes for years. After explaining the situation and sending him the deed, the survey, and the letters, he chuckled softly on the phone. "This is a classic HOA overreach. They don't have a leg to stand on. If they push this into court, they'll embarrass themselves. Then why does it feel like I'm fighting a war just to use my own lake? I asked, because bullies don't quit until someone makes them, he said simply, armed with that reassurance. I carried on. I launched the boat whenever I pleased, sometimes just to make a point. But each time, I noticed the hostility growing. Some neighbors stopped waving when they drove by. Others whispered loudly enough for me to hear as I walked past. Children who used to ride their bikes near my driveway now avoided it, steered away by nervous parents who treated me like some kind of villain. It was absurd, and yet it weighed on me. One evening, as I was cleaning the boat, I heard a knock at the door. It was my next-door neighbor, a quiet man named Tom who usually kept to himself. He shifted uncomfortably on my porch, glancing around like he didn't want to be seen. I just wanted to say, he muttered, that I think you're right. About the lake. About all of it. They don't speak for everyone. His words caught me off guard. For weeks I had felt isolated, painted as the neighborhood rebel, the outcast. To hear someone quietly affirm my stance was like a crack of light through the darkness. Thanks, Tom, I said sincerely. That means more than you know. He nodded quickly, then walked away before anyone could notice him at my door. It made me realize something important. Not everyone agreed with the HOS crusade, but most people were too afraid to speak up. Fear was their weapon and silence was their ally. The tipping point came a few days later. I was out on the lake when the sirens returned. 2 squad cars pulled up near the bank, lights flashing. This time, there were more people gathered, recording, gossiping, waiting for a show. I brought the boat back in, already exhausted by the charade. The officer who approached me this time wasn't as patient as the last ones. He held up a hand. Sir, we've received multiple complaints again. We need to sort this out. I handed him the deed, the survey, the same documents as before. He looked them over, sighed, and handed them back. Looks clear to me, he admitted. But these calls keep coming in. They're tying up resources, and frankly, it's getting out of hand. I gestured toward the crowd of neighbors, toward Mrs. Kendall standing front and center with her arms crossed. I'm not the one wasting your time, I said. She is. The officer glanced at her, then back at me. His tone softened. You're within your rights. Just try to keep things peaceful, all right? Peaceful. That word echoed in my mind long after the officers left, long after the crowd dispersed. How could there be peace when a group of people was determined to strip me of my rights, to make me bend to their will? Peace wasn't possible under tyranny, not even the petty kind that came in the form of HOA bylaws. That night, as I sat by the lake with the moonlight shimmering across the water, I made a decision. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't about a boat or a lake or even an HOA. It was about freedom, the freedom to live without being strangled by the constant demands of people who thrived on control. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. But it wouldn't be on their terms. I stared out at the reflection of the moon on the water, feeling the calm strength of the lake settle into me. This was mine. I had earned it. And I wasn't going to let anyone take it away, no matter how many letters, threats, or police calls they threw my way. The war with the HOA had just begun, and I was ready for it. The following weeks turned into a test of endurance, patience, and principle. Life in the neighborhood had shifted permanently. It was no longer a place where neighbors casually waved to one another while mowing lawns or chatted about weather forecasts during evening walks. It had turned into a chessboard with every move scrutinized, every glance calculated, every silence heavy with unspoken judgment. And at the center of it all stood me, the man with the boat on his own lake, the one who dared to defy the sacred scripture of the HOA. Every morning when I stepped onto my porch, I felt eyes on me. Curtains would twitch in houses across the street. Joggers would suddenly slow down, stretch in exaggerated fashion, and sneak glances at what I was doing. Even the mail carrier seemed hesitant when dropping envelopes into my box. Like proximity to me might earn him a black mark on some invisible HOA ledger. I had become infamous, and not by choice. The letters continued. Some from the HOA, some from neighbors emboldened by anonymity. Most were typed, but a few were handwritten in shaky, furious scrawls. One told me I was destroying community values. Another threatened to make sure you regret living here. A particularly dramatic one accused me of single-handedly bringing shame upon the neighborhood. I kept them in a drawer, not because I wanted to relive the vitriol, but because I had learned that documentation mattered. Every word, every threat, every petty attempt to paint me as a villain might one day serve as evidence. Mrs. Kendall predictably escalated. She didn't just limit her crusade to letters and phone calls to the police. She started recruiting. I'd see her standing in driveways with small groups of neighbors, gesturing animatedly, her voice carrying in shrill bursts across the street. Sometimes she'd hand out papers. Flyers, I realized, when one blew into my yard during a windy afternoon. Across the top in bold letters it read, "Protect our community, stop the lake abuse." Beneath it were a series of half-truths and outright lies about me. They claimed I was polluting the water with my boat, endangering children, disturbing wildlife, and threatening property values. It was absurd, laughable even, but I knew propaganda had power. Repeat a lie enough times, and it starts to sound like truth. Not everyone bought into it, though. Tom, the quiet neighbor who had whispered his support before, stopped by again one evening. He lingered at the edge of my driveway, clearly nervous. "They're planning something," he said. "Some kind of vote or petition. They think if they get enough people behind it, they can push you out." I raised an eyebrow. "Push me out? This isn't a rental. This is my property." He shrugged helplessly. "You know how they are. They'll twist things. They're saying if you won't follow the rules, they'll force you to sell and leave." For a moment, I felt a cold weight in my chest. The idea of being forced from my own home, my sanctuary, the place I had poured years of savings and sweat into, was almost unthinkable. But then I reminded myself of the facts. They didn't own this lake. They didn't control this property. They couldn't just erase my rights because it inconvenienced their sense of authority. Still, hearing it said aloud put steel in my spine. If they were going to try, I would be ready. My lawyer, Harris, was steady as ever. When I brought him the flyers and the threatening letters, he skimmed through them and shook his head. "They're digging their own hole," he said. "Libel, harassment, misuse of HOA funds if they're printing these with association money. If this goes to court, we'll countersue. You'll come out stronger, but lawsuits take time, and in the meantime, I still had to live among these people." Trips to the grocery store became uncomfortable encounters. A woman I barely knew from 2 streets over glared at me in the produce aisle and muttered, "Shameful." At the hardware store, a man wearing the HOA embroidered cap told me loudly, "Some people don't understand what community means." These weren't confrontations so much as small, constant cuts death by 1,000 whispers. One Saturday, I hosted my brother and his family. He brought his kids, excited to take them out on the boat. As we carried fishing rods down to the lake, I saw phones pointed at us from across the way. People were recording, waiting for me to slip up, to do something they could twist into ammunition. When my nephew caught his first fish and cheered so loudly it echoed across the water, I felt a flicker of triumph, a reminder of why I was fighting this battle in the first place. This lake was meant for joy, not control, but the HOA wasn't slowing down. A week later, a notice appeared on my door. Not mailed, not delivered politely, but taped there like a scarlet letter. It declared that the HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting to address ongoing violations and disruptions caused by certain homeowners. Everyone knew who certain homeowners meant. I decided to attend. Part of me dreaded it, but another part knew I couldn't stay silent. If they were going to drag my name through the mud, I would face them head on. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a bland room with beige walls and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. The air was thick with tension when I walked in. Conversations hushed, heads turned, and the atmosphere shifted like a collective intake of breath. Mrs. Kendall stood at the front, radiating smugness. She began with her usual flourish, talking about community standards and shared values. Then she launched into her attack, listing my supposed offenses: unauthorized boat launches, disturbance of peace, endangerment of property values. Her voice rose higher and higher, feeding off the murmurs of agreement from her loyal followers. When she finally paused for breath, I stood. The room quieted instantly. I could feel their eyes boring into me, some hostile, some curious, a few maybe sympathetic. I held up the deed, the survey, the county's stamped records. This lake is mine, not yours. Not the HOS, mine. You can dislike it, you can gossip about it, you can complain until your voices give out, but you cannot take away what I own. You don't get to rewrite legal boundaries because you don't like my boat. You don't get to harass me, threaten me, or try to force me from my home. This isn't about community. This is about control, and I won't bow to it. For a moment, silence. Then the room erupted. Some shouted in anger, others clapped, a few murmured agreement. The divide was visible, a crack splitting the room into two camps. Mrs. Kendall's face burned red, her jaw tight with fury. She banged a gavel on the table, demanding order, that the damage was done. The illusion of unanimous support had shattered that night. As I walked home under the cool wash of starlight, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: hope. Not everyone was against me. Some had been waiting for someone to stand up, to challenge the tyranny. The HOO had power, yes, but their power relied on fear and compliance. And I had shown that fear could be broken. Still, I knew the battle wasn't over. Far from it. The HOA wouldn't back down easily, not with their pride on the line. They'd find new angles, new tactics, new ways to make my life difficult. But I was ready. I had the truth, the law, and my own stubborn resolve. I stood on the edge of the lake that night, the water calm and silver under the moon, and I made a promise to myself. Whatever came next, lawsuits, threats, more police calls, I would not surrender. This was more than property. This was about principle. And principles are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The days after the HOO meeting were some of the strangest I had ever lived through. On the surface, everything in the neighborhood looked the same trimmed hedges, the same carefully painted mailboxes, the same kids riding their bikes in slow loops around cul-de-sacs. But beneath that calm exterior, the air was thick with division. People had chosen sides, and the invisible lines cut across yards, friendships, and years of neighborly civility. Some avoided me like I carried a disease. Others gave small, cautious nods when they thought no one was looking. And then there were those who doubled down on their hostility, staring openly, whispering louder, making sure I knew that I had become enemy number one. The HOA wasted no time escalating. Within a week of the meeting, I received another certified letter, this one more aggressive than anything before. It accused me of ongoing violations that jeopardized the integrity of the community. It declared that the board had voted to levy fines against me $100 for each illegal use of the lake, retroactive to the very first day I launched my boat. The total they demanded was already in the thousands. The letter went on to threaten legal collection actions if I failed to pay. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter spread before me, anger coursing hot and fast. They weren't even pretending anymore. They knew the lake wasn't theirs, yet they were fabricating rules, inventing fines, trying to plead me into submission. They thought money would break me where intimidation had failed. I called Harris, my lawyer, and read him the letter. He chuckled, though it wasn't a laugh of amusement, more of disbelief. "They're bluffing," he said. "HOAs can't fine you for something outside their jurisdiction. This is harassment, plain and simple. Keep every letter, every notice. We'll use it all." But knowing I had the law on my side didn't make living through it any easier. The HOO had influence, and influence spreads like rot. I started getting calls from the insurance company asking questions about my risky use of the lake. Someone had reported me, claiming I was creating hazards. Then the county environmental office showed up one afternoon, saying they received complaints about fuel leaks contaminating the water. I showed them my boat, clean and well-maintained, with no sign of a leak. After a quick inspection, they left satisfied, but not before muttering about persistent calls from concerned residents. It was death by paperwork, by complaints, by harassment designed to bury me under a flood of stress. They wanted me to crack, to sell, to disappear. But each attempt only strengthened my resolve. Every letter, every call, every petty inspection became another brick in the wall of evidence I was building against them. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was fracturing. Tom came by again, this time staying longer. He told me quietly that a group of residents had started to question the HOA's tactics. Some were angry about how much money was being wasted on legal letters and unnecessary investigations. Others were simply tired of the constant drama. "There's talk of replacing Kendall," he whispered. "They're tired of her dragging everyone into her crusade." That was the first real glimmer of hope. For weeks I had felt surrounded, besieged, isolated. But now, cracks were forming in the fortress of the HOA. Pride and control could only carry Kendall so far before people began to realize that she was draining their pockets and peace of mind. Still, she wasn't giving up. One evening, I was sitting on my deck when flashing lights appeared again at the end of the street. 2 police cars pulled up, and my heart sank with the familiar routine. By now, I almost expected it, like the HOA had the department on speed dial. But this time, it wasn't just officers. A county code enforcement officer stepped out too, clipboard in hand. "Evening," the lead officer said, clearly weary of the whole charade. "We've had another call about unauthorized activity on the lake." I gestured toward the still glassy water. My boat was tied neatly to the dock, unmoving. "As you can see, nothing's happening. Just me sitting here drinking my coffee." The officer rubbed his forehead. "Yeah, I can see that. Honestly, sir, this is getting ridiculous. These calls are wasting resources. If it were up to me, I'd tell them to stop harassing you, but..." He glanced at the code officer. The code officer stepped forward, flipping through papers. "We've been asked to confirm property boundaries again. There's a claim that your dock encroaches onto HOA-controlled land." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "My dock? The same dock that's been here for 20 years, built by the previous owner, inspected and approved by the county? That dock?" He looked embarrassed but nodded. "I have to check." So we walked the boundary lines again. I showed him the survey markers, the old documents, the county records. He scribbled notes, took photos, and finally admitted, "It all checks out. Docks on your land. Lakes on your land. Looks like you're fine." As they left, I caught the expression on Mrs. Kendall's face from across the street. She had been watching, of course, arms folded, lips tight, eyes burning with fury. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, almost, because this wasn't about the lake anymore. This was about her losing control, her grip slipping, her authority unraveling in front of everyone. But losing power makes people dangerous. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of voices near the water. quiet, hushed, but unmistakably there. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and walked down toward the dock. 2 teenagers scattered into the darkness, dropping a can of spray paint as they fled. On the side of my boat, in crude, dripping letters, they had scrawled, "Get out." I stood there for a long time, staring at the vandalism. It wasn't the words themselves that got to me. It was the confirmation that the hostility had infected even the kids, that the poison had spread beyond meetings and flyers and letters. It had become culture. The next morning, I took photos and sent them to Harris. "Add this to the pile," I told him. My voice was calm, but inside, something hardened. If they wanted war, then war was what they would get. Harris filed a formal harassment complaint on my behalf. He also drafted a cease and desist letter to the HOA, warning them of legal consequences if the intimidation continued. For the first time, the tide began to shift. The HOA, once so confident and loud, started to falter. They had overreached, and now the evidence was stacking against them. At the next HOA meeting, the room was different. The energy had changed. People were restless, skeptical. Some muttered openly about costs, about harassment, about how ridiculous the whole thing had become. When Mrs. Kendall tried to rally them, her words didn't land the way they used to. She raised her voice, waved her arms, but the authority she once commanded was slipping through her fingers. One man stood up and asked bluntly, "How much of our dues have you spent chasing this? And what do we have to show for it?" Another woman added, "This isn't what I signed up for. I wanted a safe, quiet neighborhood, not a war over one man's lake." The room murmured with agreement, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker across Kendall's face. When I walked out of that meeting, the night air felt different, lighter, not because the war was over, it wasn't, but because the momentum was shifting. People were waking up. They were realizing that the HOS crusade wasn't about protecting the community at all. It was about one woman's obsession with control. Standing at the edge of the lake, I let the cool wind brush across my face. The water shimmered under the moonlight, steady, calm, eternal. This lake had been here long before me, and it would be here long after. It was mine for now, and I would protect it, not just from outsiders, but from the insidious grip of petty power. The HOA had thrown everything they could at me: fines, threats, police, even vandalism. But I was still standing, and I wasn't done. If they wanted to push this fight into the courts, I'd meet them there. If they wanted to turn the neighborhood against me, I'd show the truth. They thought they could break me, but they didn't understand. This wasn't about a boat. It wasn't even about a lake. It was about freedom, and freedom is worth every battle. The morning after the hearing had left me with a strange mix of exhaustion and renewed determination. The night had been restless, thoughts tumbling through my mind as though every corner of my brain was arguing with itself. I had won a small skirmish, but the war was far from over. The HOO had made it painfully clear that they were not going to back down, not without pushing me as far as they possibly could. The sound of my boat still haunted them. The idea of someone enjoying their own lake without bowing to their rules was like poison dripping into their carefully constructed kingdom. I poured myself a cup of coffee, staring out at the lake shimmering in the early light. Mist hovered above the water's surface, turning it into something almost ethereal. This was mine, I reminded myself. This land, this lake, the stream I had built with sweat and sacrifice, it was not theirs to dictate. My fingers tightened around the warm ceramic of the mug as a thought settled deeper into me. They might have power in their rules, in their meetings, in their fines, but I had something stronger. I had the truth. That day I called a local reporter, someone who had once covered a story about unfair housing association practices. I explained the situation, the harassment, the absurdity of being fined and dragged into hearings for using my own lake. At first, the reporter sounded skeptical, but when I mentioned the cops being called just because I launched a boat, there was a pause. "They called the police? For that?" she repeated, and I could practically hear her eyebrows rising on the other end of the line. We arranged to meet later that week, but the HOA wasn't sitting still. By the time I checked my mail that afternoon, there was another letter folded into a crisp envelope with their seal on it. It wasn't just a fine this time, it was a threat of a lien against my property if I did not comply with their mounting penalties. Thousands of dollars now, stacked on a shaky foundation of petty violations and trumped-up charges. I stood in my driveway staring at the words, the absurdity crashing over me like a wave. They were trying to break me financially, to force me into submission, not with reason, but with fear. I knew that I couldn't face this battle alone anymore. I called my attorney, slid the letters across his desk, and watched his jaw tighten as he read. "They don't have the legal grounds for this," he muttered, "but they're banking on you folding. This is intimidation, pure and simple." His advice was to prepare for escalation. He spoke of countersuits, of documenting every interaction, of standing firm because once bullies smell fear, they come harder. It was strange, walking back to my truck after that meeting. The sky was gray, low clouds threatening rain, and I realized how tired I was. Tired of meetings, tired of letters, tired of being made to feel like I had done something wrong when all I had done was live my life. Yet, beneath that tiredness, a fire had been lit. If they wanted to fight, then I would not give them silence. The first article went live 2 weeks later. The headline screamed about the absurdity of a homeowner harassed for launching a boat on his own lake. The story painted a vivid picture of the confrontation, the police call, the HOS relentless fines. My phone buzzed endlessly that day, neighbors, friends, even strangers reaching out with words of support. Social media spread it like wildfire, and suddenly my private battle had become a public conversation about overreach, about the abuse of power that too often went unchecked in neighborhoods bound by associations. The HOA board members were furious. That much was clear when I received another summons, this time accusing me of slander and defamation. Their arrogance was staggering. They thought they could silence me through fear of legal consequences, but they didn't realize that by now the story was far bigger than just me. Other homeowners from nearby communities began reaching out, sharing their own stories of harassment, of fines for trivialities, of intimidation tactics that echoed my own nightmare. I decided to host a gathering at my property, an open meeting for anyone who wanted to share their experiences. That Saturday, folding chairs dotted my backyard, the lake a calm witness to our collective voices. People came carrying manila folders, stacks of letters, photographs of supposed violations that were laughably petty. A swing set painted the wrong shade, a flower bed planted without prior approval, a small shed deemed out of harmony with the neighborhood. The stories piled up, each one a brick in the wall that exposed the pettiness and cruelty of unchecked HOA boards. As people spoke, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every person who had been bullied into silence. Every family that had swallowed fines and intimidation because they didn't have the energy or resources to fight back. My lake had become more than just a piece of land. It had become a symbol, a rallying point for resistance. The HOA board, of course, was livid. They sent security to monitor the gathering, cars idling near the end of my driveway, as if daring me to make a move they could pounce on. Some of the neighbors who attended whispered about being afraid of retaliation, of their own letters escalating if they were seen at my property. That fear only fueled my anger. No one should feel like a prisoner in their own home. Weeks stretched into months, each side digging in deeper. My attorney filed motions, countered every threat with documentation and law. The local press continued covering the story, and soon a regional news station picked it up, shining a brighter spotlight on the HOA's tactics. Every interview I gave, I made sure to keep my words steady, clear, and honest. I wasn't out for revenge, I was out for fairness. For the right to live in peace on land I owned outright. Still, the pressure was immense. Some nights I sat alone by the lake, listening to the soft lap of water against the shore, wondering if it was worth it. I thought of selling, of walking away from the endless letters and threats, of finding some place where I could live quietly. But then I would look at the water, at the reflection of the stars across the surface, and I would remember why I had fought so hard in the first place. This wasn't just property. This was home. The turning point came when one of the police officers who had been called that first day reached out to me privately. He admitted he had felt ridiculous being dispatched over something so trivial, that he and his partner had shaken their heads the whole drive back. "You're not wrong," he told me quietly. "They're abusing their authority. We see it more than you think." Hearing those words, that validation, struck deeper than I expected. For months, I had been made to feel like the villain, like a troublemaker, but here was someone outside the storm acknowledging the truth. The lawsuit the HOA filed against me dragged on, but cracks began to show in their armor. Public opinion was no longer in their favor. At board meetings, more homeowners started speaking up, emboldened by the coverage and the gatherings. Their once unified facade of control began to splinter. People demanded transparency, questioned where their dues were going, challenged the necessity of the constant fines. What had started as a private war was now a rebellion brewing within the community itself. I could see it in their eyes the last time I faced them across a long, polished table. They were still smug, still threatening, but there was something else now: fear. Not of me, but of losing the stranglehold they had enjoyed for so long. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized the tide was turning, but victory, I knew, would not come easily. They would lash out harder before the end. The next few months would be critical, a test of endurance, of resolve. I finished my cup of coffee, set it down, and stepped out onto my deck. The lake sparkled under the midday sun, calm and unbothered, as if reminding me that some things were beyond the reach of petty rules and paperwork. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything still ahead, and whispered to the water, "I'm not going anywhere." The weeks that followed felt like a chess game played in the dark. Every move I made seemed to provoke a countermove from the HOA, and every countermove of theirs gave me one more reason to dig deeper into my resolve. The air in the neighborhood had changed. Where once it was just a backdrop of manicured lawns and polite nods, now there was a current of tension running beneath it all, like static waiting for a storm. Some neighbors avoided me completely, their eyes darting away as though afraid that acknowledgement alone would mark them for punishment by the board. Others stopped me quietly when no one was watching, slipping words of encouragement that were brief but sincere. I carried those small moments like armor. My attorney warned me the next phase would be ugly. The HOA had filed for an injunction, claiming I was a public nuisance and disrupting the harmony of the community with my gatherings, my interviews, my insistence on using the lake without their approval. It was absurd, but it was dangerous too. If the injunction went through, it could restrict my ability to host meetings or even to launch my boat at all while the court battle played out. The thought of them winning, even temporarily, made my chest tighten with frustration. But as much as I worried about their tactics, I began to see how their arrogance was unraveling them. At one of the board's monthly meetings, which by now drew more residents than it ever had before, a shouting match broke out between two members of the board themselves. One accused the president of mishandling funds, bringing up invoices that had quietly slipped into the communities. budget for administrative expenses that didn't seem to add up. The room buzzed with murmurs, the residents emboldened by the cracks showing in the facade. I stood at the back, watching, saying nothing, but inside I felt the momentum shifting. The reporter I had spoken with months ago came back for a follow-up piece, this time with a camera crew. They filmed the lake, the dock, the worn letters from the HOA, the fine notices piling up like a deck of cards designed to crush me under their weight. They interviewed residents who had attended the gatherings, their faces shadowed for anonymity, voices trembling with a mixture of fear and anger as they spoke about the pressure, the intimidation, the endless pettiness. When the segment aired, it caught fire. National outlets picked it up, sparking debates online about HOAs, property rights, and the fine line between community management and authoritarian control. The HOA's fury was palpable. They doubled down with letters that grew more aggressive, threats that bordered on unhinged. My attorney calmly dismantled each one, sending replies that carried the weight of law. But even he admitted their relentlessness was unusual. "They're desperate," he said one late afternoon as we sat across his cluttered desk, papers spread between us. "And desperate people make mistakes." He was right. Not long after, a whistleblower came forward, one of the HOA's own hired security guards. He'd been ordered to monitor my property, to take photographs of who came and went, to record the times I launched my boat. It was invasive, borderline illegal, and when he handed over his notes to my attorney, it became the crack that widened into a gaping wound. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, reading through the log he kept, pages of dates and times, details of my daily routines, even notes about guests who had stopped by. My stomach turned as the violation sank in. They hadn't just been harassing me with letters. They had been watching me, documenting me like I was some criminal. Rage coursed through me, hot and unrelenting, but beneath it was also a grim satisfaction. They had crossed a line, and now I had proof. The lawsuit flipped overnight. With the whistleblower's testimony, with the logs, with the mounting media coverage, the HOA no longer looked like a governing body. They looked like stalkers. My attorney filed a countersuit for harassment, invasion of privacy, and abuse of power. The court accepted the motion, and suddenly, the board that had once stood so tall found themselves scrambling to defend their actions under a microscope far harsher than they'd ever expected. But the war wasn't over, not yet. They still had influence, still had neighbors who clung to the illusion that rules and order mattered more than fairness. They still sent me letters, though now their tone was more erratic, almost frantic. At night, I would sit by the lake, listening to the quiet, and wonder how much longer this would stretch, how much further they would go before it all collapsed. The community itself had transformed. Walking through the streets, I could feel eyes on me. Some were hostile, others sympathetic, but no one was indifferent anymore. Children no longer played as freely in the cul-de-sacs. Parents whispered about whether the neighborhood was safe. Not because of crime, but because of the battle tearing it apart. The harmony the HOA claimed to protect had been shattered, but it wasn't my boat that had broken it. It was their obsession with control. Climax came one rain-soaked evening in late autumn. I was preparing dinner when a knock rattled my door. On the other side stood two police officers, their uniforms damp, their expressions strained. My stomach dropped, bracing for yet another absurd escalation. But this time, they weren't there for me. They were there with warrants to seize records from the HOA's office, apparently. The whistleblower had triggered more than just my case. Investigations had begun into their finances, their misuse of community funds, their surveillance tactics. What they had done to me was only one part of a larger pattern of abuse that spanned years. The officers explained it calmly, their words almost surreal, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I exhaled without the weight of fear pressing down. News spread quickly. The next HOA meeting was chaos. Board members shouting over each other. Residents demanding answers, the air electric with anger and betrayal. Some of the loudest voices that night were the same people who had once supported the board unquestioningly, now turning on them with venom. I didn't even need to speak. I just sat, listening, watching as the empire they had built on intimidation crumbled from within. Still, victory wasn't immediate. Legal processes dragged on, countersuits and appeals, stacking up like bricks in a never-ending wall. The board president remained defiant, insisting in interviews that I was the true troublemaker, that I had poisoned the community, but each word he spoke only dug the hole deeper, painting him not as a leader, but as a tyrant refusing to face the truth. I kept living. I kept launching my boat, sometimes in silence, sometimes with friends, sometimes with the quiet company of the lake itself. Each time I pushed off from the dock, each time the water carried me into its calm embrace, it felt like an act of defiance, but also an act of healing. The lake didn't care about their rules. The lake didn't care about fines or threats. It simply existed, free and untamed, and in that, I found my own freedom too. Months passed. The board fractured completely, lawsuits bleeding them dry, investigations unearthing misdeeds they had long buried. One by one, they resigned, some with angry speeches, others with silence. The president held out the longest, but eventually, even he disappeared from the neighborhood, his house left vacant, a for sale sign leaning awkwardly in the yard. When it was over, when the dust settled, I stood on the shore of my lake and let the silence wash over me. It wasn't triumph, I felt, not exactly. It was something quieter, deeper, relief, vindication, the sense that I had stood against something larger than myself and hadn't been broken by it. The community began to heal slowly, cautiously. New leadership was elected, people who promised transparency and fairness, who swore they had learned from the nightmare that had unfolded. Some neighbors apologized, their words awkward but sincere. Others still kept their distance, unable or unwilling to bridge the gap that had grown. That was fine. I wasn't looking for everyone's approval. I only wanted peace, and I had it now. The lake glittered in the fading light, the ripples catching the last blush of sunset. I pushed my boat into the water, the wood creaking softly beneath me, and rowed out into the heart of it. The air smelled fresh, cleansed by the earlier rain, and the sky stretched wide and endless above me. For the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to feel it fully freedom, unshackled and undeniable. This was mine. It always had been, and no one could take it away again.